Hi everyone, welcome back. This is our final workshop of the day, making music for games, and I'm joined here with Ged Grimes from Simple Minds and Colin Anderson from Denki Games. Great to have you guys here today. I'm Kaylee and I'm the event coordinator for Resonate, so any questions, just drop messages in the chat box at the side. And yeah, just drop any questions for the guys as well throughout the session. And again, I'll ask these at the end. Without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Colin and Ged, take it away.
Hello, my name is Colin Anderson. I've experienced a little bit of feedback. I can see Ged reaching for his thing. Okay, I'll turn the volume down.
On mute, Ged, so when you want to speak, just unmute yourself.
I've been working in video games for about 30 years at this point. I started as an audio engineer for DMA Design in Dundee back in 1993. And then from there, I was put in charge of the department. I was originally the only audio engineer at DMA Design working on their video games. I was then put in charge of creating a department that worked across, I think, about 8 teams that they were working on. Worked there for 7 or 8 years. Worked on probably about a dozen games for them, of which the biggest was Grand Theft Auto, which most people have heard of. And that gave me the opportunity to then kind of step out of just focusing entirely on video game audio and actually set up an independent game studio. So I did that in 2000. And since then, I've been working as an independent video game producer on all sorts of games for platforms ranging from Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance right through to Xbox One and PlayStation 4. So yeah, I know a fair bit about implementing audio in games. I know a lot about how games get made, and hopefully we'll be able to explore a little bit of how those two industries work and how they can maybe work closer together. So I'll pass it to Ged at this point, and he can explain a little bit more about his journey. Work and how they Ged at this point, and he can explain a little bit more about his journey.
Hi Ged, you're just on mute at the moment. If you could just unmute yourself, it's just the microphone icon just in your picture. Hi Ged, you're just on mute at the moment. If you could just unmute yourself, it's just the microphone icon. Is there a microphone button there, Ged? Just at the bottom of your screen, there should be a cross through a mic. Yeah, that's it now. You should be...
Sorry, running 2 screens here, and the camera screen was obscuring it. Sorry, quick recap. My name's Ged Grimes. I've been involved with making music for 40 odd years in the record industry, and I'm currently a member of Simple Minds. I've been the bassist for Simple Minds for the past 10 years. God, time just flies in. However, I've also had a parallel career writing game music soundtracks. My first game was a game called Earthbound Games 3D that I worked on in the late 90s. And so, you know, I've had a pretty long career to see how music in games has changed, and from back then to where it is now. And Colin and I know each other well because we worked on one of Denki's great releases called Quarrel, which was a game that was released probably around 10 years ago now. But that was a fantastic project to work on. So Colin and I can chat a lot about the the whole process of the procurement of music and how working with the game designers, you know, how important it is to kind of just, you know, collaborate. So happy to chat about any aspect of my double life. And I'm just thankful for my double life, because at the moment, obviously, with live music being off the agenda, I'm concentrating on working on game soundtracks, and I'm working in the studio in Dundee. So it was a good decision back in the 90s to get involved in it, because it's been a good counterbalance to my life in the band. So yeah, happy to chat away about any aspect of what I do. Are you there, Kaylee?
Should we just keep talking at this point?
Guys, just take it away, guys. I'll be here if you need to just go back in. If you guys just want to have a conversation between yourselves.
Okay. So I'll interview you, Colin, right?
Okay, and I'll interview you. How's about that? That's going to work.
So I think we first kind of were aware of each other just when DMA were getting going, when you were starting to work on GTA. And I think it came through the music shop in Dundee, because you guys were the first guys that were buying Pro Tools gear, and I was like, who are these guys? What's going on? You know, like nobody buys Pro Tools in Dundee. And then shortly after that, I was made aware of just how important the aspect of the music production for games was becoming, and you were leading the team at DMA. So maybe if you just kind of maybe chat a little bit about what you were doing before that, and how you got involved in that side of things, your first sort of, you know, major kind of gig.
Yeah. Essentially, I got lucky. I think that's the thing I have to like confess completely up front, was I didn't set out to work in video games. I was a keen musician. I wanted to work in the audio industry, and my passion was recording. So I was really interested in audio recording. I wanted to be a record producer. I guess that was what my first love was. But I ran into a bit of problems with my dad, particularly, who just was completely not having that. He's like, I don't know how record producers make money. You got to remember, this guy, you know, my dad planted trees for a living. You know, he had no concept of how people made money from music. So so the deal I came to with him was I'd have to go and study something that he understood how I could make a career out of, and then if I still wanted to do music after that, then I could go and do it. So I actually went and studied chemistry at university. So I'm a card-carrying scientist, really. But at the same time, I was working in games. And, I was working in music, and I was playing in bands. I was recording my friends' bands, you know, who were playing. And at the same time, I was studying computers. So I was in a flat where I had a group of guys who had Commodore Amiga computers, and they were one of the first computers that had sampling technology built into them. So I just got really interested in how you could capture, manipulate, and then play back samples. And this was at a time, probably late 80s, early 90s, when sampling was still really expensive and certainly pretty rare. So that kind of gave me the step into using computers. And then at the end of my university course, I started applying for jobs in something to do with creative industries, and one of my flatmates was applying for a games job at DMA, and so I helped him put together a demo that he was going to use to get a job, and lo and behold, they were looking for a sound designer at the same time. So I just, you know, they said, can you both come for an interview? And kind of that's where I went from. So I think in terms of how do people get into the video games industry, I'm not entirely sure that it's changed that much since that time, and that there is a lot of it that's to do with just focusing on a passion, whatever it is you're particularly keen on, and then following that to its logical conclusion, and just networking, getting out there, working with other people, doing projects, because it wasn't my skills as a musician that got me the job really, so much as the portfolio of stuff that I built up. I was working away with these Commodore Amiga computers. So that's a piece of advice I always give to people who are looking to get into the games industry, which is just focus on building a portfolio that shows that you have an awareness of the video games industry and the kind of the technology and language, because that's maybe something you can actually speak to a little bit more, which is I'm a geek. It's like I grew up with computers and making music and sound effects on computers. Your route into the industry is entirely different. You're much more traditional music based, and you came in that way. So
yeah, I mean, for me, it was kind of, I mean, when I look back on it now, I got a lot of flack from my sort of contemporaries in the music business, because I'd been making records, I'd been signed to Virgin for like the better part of sort of 8 or 9 years, put out 3 albums with Danny Wilson, went on to produce other stuff, but I was firmly in the music industry. And then when the opportunity came along to write for the Earthbound Games soundtrack, and I mentioned it to my friends in the music business, they were like, "You're crazy, you've lost it. This is like, see ya," because the perception obviously of computer games music back then was that it was, really rudimentary, and and there's reasons for that, as you can speak to as well. But the technological challenges back then, when you really only had a tiny amount of MIDI sounds to play with, and so you had to be really inventive. Fortunately for me, I came in just when PlayStation 1 was coming out, so the ability to kind of have full quality audio was starting to be realized. But the key thing for me was when I first got approached to do the music, I thought, God, how this is going to be really interesting, because I'd started to play a lot more games, just basically to get my chops up and to kind of get my concepts together. And I played a game, Shadows of the Empire, which was on the Nintendo N64. And so what I was doing, I was working in the studio and I was playing that game at night before going home. And I was getting home later and later and later, because that game was like, it was John Williams's orchestral score. And the thing that I really was intrigued by was they were able to kind of have the music ebb and flow depending on how well you were doing at any time in the game, at any level of the game. And I thought, how are they managing to reward you when you've completed a mission? And, it's not linear music. So I think back then, that's kind of what really sparked my interest to, this is an area that, A, I can expand as a composer, and B, I can actually get involved in something that's deeper and something that's more creative than a new kind of way of realizing music. So I was never a gamer. I never came into this through the games industry. In fact, the first, apart from early sort of Pong and all that stuff, Asteroids, I really didn't really play many games up until getting involved in writing music for them. So, but again, back to what I was saying, the opportunity to write music for Earthworm Jim, which was like, the brief was like, okay, we need a Bond theme here, or we need a Bernard Herrmann section here. So it was almost like, to me, I was like, this is like, if I used The Simpsons as a benchmark, the way they do amazing pastiches of things, then I could really stretch my skills and learn new skills, orchestration and different kind of aspects of composing music. So I think from back then to where the games industry is now, it's just been an amazing journey. And every single game I've worked on, has been a completely different experience musically, as well as the collaboration between the games designer and me. You've got to really get inside the head of the designer to kind of what is the music that is needed for this game. So I think that's one thing I've learned as well, is that it's an amazing process in terms of, you know, if you want to go on to do stuff for film and stuff, it's a great education in how to collaborate with a team of people. And normally in the music business, you're really a kind of, you know, you're not realizing someone else's vision. It's your own vision that you're realizing. So it's an important lesson to learn, I think, you know.
I think that's one of the things that I certainly wanted to get onto today in our conversation was just about the route in for people today. Like, if you're a composer today, how do you go about getting into, how do you get those opportunities? Because, like, I'm saying, I got my opportunity largely by luck. You know, it was timing. I just happened to be one of those people who had I had the ability to program computers to make sound at a time when not a lot of people had those skills. So I got in that way. You got in obviously off the back of the connections and reputation you built up through your work with Danny Wilson and all the projects around that. But, you know, if somebody's there today, maybe they don't have that kind of background that you have, where you already had built a reputation, and they maybe don't get the lucky break that I had, where I got my timing right. What would you be suggesting to them in terms of what they should be focusing on now to try and up the chances of creating that kind of opportunity for themselves?
Well, yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when you look back and you think, you know, a lot of the games I've worked on have kind of been with a core of people that just keep coming back, you know, and it's that catch-22, is it? It's always, how do you get a foothold in the industry? How do you start, you know? And to me, the only thing that one of the things I've learned is that try not to be jack of all trades, you know. I mean, don't be oh yeah, I do drum and bass as well as orchestral music, and you know, it's kind of like be amazing at one thing is really quite a good thing to focus on. And so I think I mean, we're lucky in Scotland in that we've got a real vibrant games industry, and maybe later on we'll talk a wee bit about some of the networking opportunities within games, because I'm sure a lot of the musicians that are tuned in today, it's a different world, you know. I mean, it still operates as a different world. And funnily enough, Colin, just when you mentioned, even though I had a pedigree of making records and stuff, it was like, who is this guy coming in on our patch, right? It was kind of like when I started working on some American games and I was across there, it was kind of like, well, he hasn't done many games, so it's not really, I don't care what he's done in the music business. So it was hard to start with to get established. But like anything, it's like producing records. It's like when somebody, you know, trusts you with taking on a project, you have to be all over it, really. So it's not just your musical skills. Your technical skills are really important. Your ability to know when you need to bring someone in, you know, to do something, or your soundtrack could be this, but here's what I need to make that happen, you know. So
sorry, I was going to say, that's interesting that you say that, because when I'm explaining it to students and things, I often try and explain that opportunities to work in games for musicians are many and varied, and that it's kind of a spectrum of opportunity you have, and that at one extreme you could literally just be a session musician who is, you know, the premier person for that particular instrument. Now, you had a lot of experience with that on your Gallic soundtrack that you did for Bard's Tale, where you were working with the premier musicians of that genre. And then I'm thinking, even with the project that we did with Quarrel, we settled on pedal steel guitar for a lot of the sound effects. And who did we bring in? Chris Mara, because because you know, he's in Dundee, he's already connected to us, and we know that he he's amazing at that. So there's an opportunity to get in on that side, but then it extends from there through to composing an entire soundtrack for a video game, through to designing all the sounds, including all the sound effects and so on, right through to actually being the person who implements all those sounds into the game. So you can kind of jump into that process at any point, and different people do that. That's certainly myself, for example. I tend to sit somewhere in the middle. I have to work with people who help me put the sounds into the game. But I kind of understand the entire project, and I can help a game producer figure out what the audio design is for their project. So,
and that audio design thing is incredibly important. So I don't know if that's kind of neatly taken us into talking about Quarrel, because well, maybe you could give a wee background to Quarrel, and then I'll come in with the approach in terms of music.
So Quarrel was a game that we started working on at Denki. It was probably 2008 thereabouts, so over 10 years ago now. And the intention for it was to be an arcade word game. We mashed up Risk, the board game Risk, and the board game Scrabble. We stuck them together, and we wanted it to be this really entertaining, fast-paced board game. And if anybody's interested and hasn't seen it, if you go to my Twitter page, which is just at Denki Colin, I've tweeted out just this afternoon a link to a video so you can have a look at what the game looks like. And in there, you'll hear a lot of the sounds for that. But what was really important for me, being somebody who came from an audio background and was now in charge of running a studio that's creating this, was that we didn't build the game and then just phone Ged or whoever else up at the end of the process and say, okay, we've got some space to bring some sound in, can you create something? For us, one of the first things we wanted to do was to bring someone in to work with us the whole way through that, in order to really realize the best version of sound for that game, down to things like what kind of instrumentation are we going to use. And I remember having lots of conversations about that. And hopefully you can talk a little bit about how we did that. But yeah, that whole process of the projects that work best in the video games industry, I think, are the ones where the person who's directing the game has a holistic view of the entire project. They understand that the gameplay is important, they understand the visuals are important, they understand the story is important, they understand the audio is important. They do not overemphasize any one of those, but they understand how they all work together and they blend it together into something. And that was definitely something that we wanted to achieve with Quarrel. And I think, as anybody who watches the video can see, I think it's something we delivered on pretty well. And the audio was certainly a big part of that. So tell us.
Well, to me, this was kind of like a dream project, because you understand music and because you are a musician, right? It's not every day when you're working with a games company that the level of conversation about the music is as defined and as rarefied as our discussions about the game. But having said that, when I heard from yourself and Gary Penn that the benchmark for the music was like Cuban 50s big band, Perez Prado, Tito Puente. That type of music is incredibly complex, right? So the ambition, I think, for Quarrel was laid out from the start. And as soon as we started discussing what is it about that music that fits Quarrel, it was really about the music really needed to be a character in the game and a color that could kind of speak. It was almost like the instruments were going to speak to you, which is why we ended up choosing, pedal steel, and we had the brass was really important in the game, percussion, little kind of vignettes of music that rewarded you when you did well or made you feel bad when you failed at something. But didn't make you feel too bad, right? So the music was kind of reactive to how well you were doing. However, I do remember a conversation, and maybe this is just because because of my experience in the industry, to go, right, the best way to do this is to present 3 options, right? So option 1 was, okay, this is the brief for the music. I can do it all using samples, right? That's option 1, right? Option 2 is we hire in some key musicians to kind of make the music breathe, and I'll work around that. And you know, some of it will be simulated, and some of it will be completely live. And the third option, I remember this one, floating this one, is we'll go to Cuba, right, and we just work with a bunch of musicians in situ. Right? We get a studio. It doesn't matter if it's a leaking roof, and we'll make the soundtrack there, right? So. Not surprisingly, the budget didn't stretch to that option, but what it did do was it allowed me to kind of get in some key musicians, trumpet player, sax player, Chris on the pedal steel, and you know, I played a lot of stuff as well. But between those musicians being live and the soundtrack, the music ended up having this elasticity, is the only way I can put it. It kind of was like just like a character, you know, like a sort of talking character in the game. So you felt quite kind of warm and fuzzy when the music was rewarding you, you know. So another thing about that is, you know, it's a key thing when you're working with a games company is not only the style of the music, but what is the palette, what would work in this game, and what is a definite no-no, right? So with us, Colin, we could get down into that level of detail, and it's only really in the last, you know, 5-6 years that the games I've worked on, because the audio and the music is so important now in the gameplay, that the level of detail is really being discussed now, to the point that, you know, the music is such an important factor. That, I mean, I've always felt that it's been an important factor, but now the integration of the music as well into the game, and that was one of the things about Quarrel that I was really happy with, you know, was that, you know, because you understood the music from the word go and it was baked into the audio design, I'd be coming to the offices and you'd have a change in the game, and I'd feel inspired to, that could be, yeah, what we could do with the trombones there is this. So the level of integration was far greater than you get in a lot of games, and I think it ended up being a really rewarding project to work on. At the end of the day, we you know, the game was great. The game was, I love it. I still play it. You know? I think
that is really important. Anybody that's working in games understand your role is to make the music great, although that's part of it. Your role as a musician in the video games industry is to make the game even greater. You know, it's a subtle distinction, but it's so important, because the times when I feel it hasn't worked is when we've sometimes worked with musicians who they came in with a very clear understanding of what they wanted to do, and they couldn't understand why what they were setting out to do didn't really gel with the overall vision for the game, and so you ended up with this juxtaposition between these two things. And they're probably the opposite of the relationship that you've spoken about there, where it was working really well in Quarrel. You need people to understand that, like, a lot of the time in video games, musicians are used to creating songs with hooks, right? A lot of time is spent creating amazing top lines and little hooks for choruses and things like that. And that can actually backfire in video games, because a lot of the tracks, they loop, they're maybe a minute or sometimes even 30 seconds long, and then looping for what can be 5-10 minutes. You've no idea. You, as a designer, you have no control over how long the player is going to spend on that particular part of the game. So it's a bit of a fine art to understand that sometimes your music has to take a back seat. It's about serving the player's experience, I think.
That thing about the looping thing's really important, isn't it? Because that was the one thing about Shadows of the Empire, right? 25 years ago that got me. And I was lucky enough to go and visit LucasArts that made that game about 3 years later. And again, this is probably going to lead on to a discussion about tools and stuff like that. But the reason that they were able to have that music so well integrated was that LucasArts had built their own custom iMuse tool, and they had like a full-time three of the top guys purely working on that. They had the research and development, so that when they took John Williams's music, they could edit and cut and use this tool to integrate it into the game and affect the player's emotion. Now, for many years, those tools were not really available. You know, like in terms of you know, as an independent composer, being able to go and buy a tool to integrate your music into Xbox games wasn't really available, or there'd be a tool for one platform and then you couldn't port the game to another platform. It's just like, it was a mess. So that's the one thing I've kind of... yeah, sorry.
Going back to the earlier point about, you know, you first becoming aware of what I was doing at DMA Design back in the 90s when we were buying up like every Pro Tool system that was going at the time. There was a bit of a journey there. So when I first went into games, because you were coding the music at quite a low level, you were really close to the metal in terms of you were pushing bits around, and so your ability to make the game music interactive kind of came naturally. It was part of it. When we moved into the CD age, it was much harder to make the music interactive. So teams like LucasArts, where they built the iMuse system that was taking John Williams' music, breaking it down into all the individual stems and then varying the volumes. You could do that on the platforms like the Super Nintendo and even to some extent the Sega Saturn. But by the time you got onto the PlayStation and the Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, although Nintendo 64 is a bit different, it was really hard to make video game music interactive, and that was one of the inspirations for GTA. Was we were having real difficulty figuring out how we're going to make music interactive, and that was where that whole idea of, well, what if we just made the music, you know, put it in a radio station in a car so it stopped. It started when you got in the car and then stopped when you got out. It's a pretty basic version of interactivity, but it's better than nothing, right? It's like, yeah, that'll do. So, you know, we kind of went from there. It's come out the other side now, which is, you know, we were mixing music for GTA on Pro Tools, so we had all the individual stems. We were doing it all in the box. This was, you know, back in the mid 90s, I guess, when that was still pretty uncommon. But we could see, if we had access to a Pro Tool system in the game where you had the mixer and the EQ and all the effects and stuff, you could bring the interactivity back, but with the added quality that you get from CD quality music. And that's where we're getting to now. So the new consoles that are coming out, like Xbox One X and the PlayStation 5 and things like that, they're going to have the kind of powers to be able to do things like that, where you're not just able to emulate or simulate John Williams music. You can literally remix it live in the box whilst the game's being played based on the performance of the player. I mean, that's incredibly exciting in terms of having seen the technology go, like, just within my career, from one extreme to that. Because as you said right at the start, one of the reasons it was so easy to get into game music back in the early 90s was nobody wanted to do it because people wouldn't even believe it was actually real music. I used to get that all the time in reviews that we'd get. It's like, music's really good for game music. It was always those three words, for game music, at the end.
It's crazy. I mean, even last year, when I did that, the 2018, the Bard's Tale game came out. And the Bard's Tale is like this adventure, this bard in 18th century Scotland, you know, and it was an American company, and they approached me to have a totally traditional Scottish soundtrack with Gaelic voices right at the forefront of it. So it was an amazing project to work on, and out the back of that, Celtic Connections asked me to put together a show for you know, get all the musicians involved in that game, because, you know, this is a good story for Gaelic as well. It's like Gaelic being used in an Xbox game is brilliant. And then I went to kind of promote it for Celtic Connections. You know, Celtic Connections were pushing the whole thing, press everywhere. This thing that was a challenge was that people were going, "Oh, I don't play games." You know, it's like, or like, "No, that's not for me," right? And I'm like, these are like world-class, amazing Gaelic artists, right, who were a total joy to work with. And there was still that confusion between, oh, I might not like that because I don't play games. And couldn't be further from the truth, you know. It's like, but I still think, yeah, hopefully, now that games, you know, digital entertainment has been one of the you know, things that COVID has actually not affected that much. Actually, it's been a real boost, you know, in terms of more people at home, more people playing, more people going deeper on games. So I'm hopeful that you know, as things get really sophisticated, in terms of what you were talking about there, Colin, as well, from a composer's point of view, being able to approach a game with the composer having all those decisions about where the music should be and how, that's kind of the ultimate goal, really, you know. I mean, the amount of times I work on games and I'm like, who's implementing this, or how can I need to get more involved in that. Plus, even working with ambient sound effects, you're right differently, you know. If you've got an ambience going on, you'll less is more. You won't fill it, you know what I mean? So all those innovations and putting the tools in the hands of the composers is you know, a great way ahead, because there'll just be much more inventive, creative things happening in games where you might not understand under the hood what's going on, but lots of creative decisions will go into how a gamer experiences music, even if he isn't aware of how he's experiencing it. And that's the beauty, I think, if you can alter people's emotions by
you
subtly, you know.
There. I'm thinking, would it be worth having a quick conversation about the kind of tools that we have in the video games for people to kind of create? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what do you use primarily when you're
Well, my main composition tool is Logic, right? But over the years, you know, working on your game, I think we used a version of Exact, you know, which was like a Microsoft tool, quite clunky, but it enabled me to kind of finish a piece of music, load it into the game, experience it within the game world. And I remember it being really clunky. I had to move to a PC to do that and everything. So it was a wee bit of a piecemeal situation. But recently, on the Bard's Tale, and again, this would have been amazing if I had these tools and I was working with them. But you know, I was mixing the music, and then I got a request for, right, we need all those mixes dry, right, because they're too ambient for the game, right? You know, and you're wandering through the game world, and you hear this Gaelic singer coming from behind this cottage, and like, so, you know, the games company had to be able to manipulate that sound without my, oh, there's my amazing reverb, and it all sounds wonderful as a record, you know. So I suppose because I've been working remotely with a lot of the games companies, I've kind of not really delved into the tools like Unity and, you know, all the different tools that musicians can use, like game engines and stuff like that. Again,
well, that's
more about
certainly something, again, I would encourage anybody who wants to work in video games and is looking maybe to move across from a sort of more traditional role in the music industry, is you do need to understand a little bit about that. But it's not a case of you do. You can choose not to, but you're always going to find it hard to compete with musicians who have that knowledge, because it's really hard to make video games, right? It just is. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot to keep track of. A lot of the time, you only know vaguely where you're going next, and you're kind of feeling your way as you go. So it's hard, and people prefer to work with other people who kind of minimizes the amount of time they need to help them, right? So if if you've got a composer that you're working with who already understands the context of games, so they know a bit about the history of games, for example. So when you say we want something like they used in Halo 3, right? You've got an understanding, or you at least know how to find that out really quickly, so that you have that kind of reference.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is that the technical references as well, where most games these days, if they're not being built by if the team isn't creating their own technology entirely from scratch, they're going to be using one of the game engines, of which there are literally hundreds. So if you go onto like Wikipedia and just search for video game engines, you'll get a huge list of all the video game engines that are currently used. There's two main ones though, which are Unreal Engine and Unity. And then I'm just going to give a quick plug for Game Maker, which is made by Yo-Yo Games here in Dundee. So a little plug for them, because they're also a big player, and it tends to work like this, where you get the kind of hobbyist gamers tend to use Game Maker. The indie gamers, who are people like myself who are working on smaller scale projects with smaller teams, will be using Unity, and then the bigger teams will be using Unreal Engine. Now, if you understand any one of those well, then that would be amazing. If you understand the basics of all of them, that would be fantastic. It all ups your chances of finding a team to work with, because that's going to be one of the first questions that you get as a musician when you go in and say, I'd love to work with you on this project. The first question you're going to get back is, do you have any experience working with Unity, Unreal, or Game Maker? Yeah. So, and if your answer to that is no, then it's going to be, well, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. No, also, it's not such a huge leap from music software in terms of looping, in terms of editing and all that stuff. So the basic concepts are pretty much, like your music tools. So if you're, I mean, that's one bit of advice I would always say is, like, you've got to dig in so deep now with Logic. Everything's there, but the things that you can do with it now are so incredible that, but you need to be on it every single day to, I go on tour with a band, I come back and I'm like, switch on Logic and I'm like, right, oh man, where's that going? So, I mean, working with that every day is really important. I'm conscious of the time here, right? And I see some questions, lots of questions coming in. But one thing that I thought would be really good for Scottish-based participants is in normal times, there's a great informative get-together at all the Scottish games companies that happens in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee. I don't think it's got a title, has it? But it's run by a guy called Colin McDonald. It's just like drinks together.
Come up with a cool name for it yet, but
it generally happens once every month. And if you pitch up at that as a composer, you'll hear game designers, game developers. It's just a great informal way of being able to go up and speak to people, and if you've got something that you want to promote or whatever, that's a great way of making contacts, and that's free. And it normally happens in a bar in Glasgow or in a bar in Dundee or Edinburgh on a regular basis. And so it's a great way of meeting the movers and shakers in the Scottish games industry, which, let's face it, punches way above its weight. Like Dundee, we're in the centre of the gaming universe here, and there's so many different companies working here now, and all their games need music.
I kind of follow on from that really is the other thing that I would always encourage people to do when it comes to trying to get into video games is attend game jams, because game jams are the easiest place to get experience of working with video games teams. So for anybody who's not familiar with the format, it tends to be a focused period of 1 or 2 days. It's usually done at a weekend, where they will literally start on, say, 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and they will try and build an entire game in 2 days, start to finish. And people do that. That's just fun for video game designers. That's kind of how we pass the time. And they used to be social things where people would actually get together. At the moment, obviously, that's on hold. But the basic principle is still the same, in that we're having online game jams now. So if you just search for the term game jam and look for game jams that are happening, turn up, and it's always a welcoming environment. There's always people looking for sound designers, musicians, composers, anybody like that. It gives you the opportunity to get involved with video games at a small scale. Now, obviously it's not a commercial proposition at this point. It's a hobbyist thing, but that's a great way of, again, just building up a portfolio, getting used to how game teams run, because it's a very different experience from working with the band or putting on a show on stage, that kind of thing. So I'd always encourage that as an opportunity as well.
Some really amazing
Absolutely.
Today. Is it okay if we take a few questions now from the audience? So, got one here from Don Shields. Are games leaning more towards established artists instead of original scores? A couple examples being GTA Radio or FIFA soundtracks, both focused on big names nowadays. And that's also leading up to, Kevin Connolly's question. How would new artists get around at getting their music into games?
Yeah, well, there's always been two parts of the music for games. The licensed tracks, right, coming into established games, and then the actual custom composing for games. So there's many games use music supervisors. You can pitch to them, but I'll be honest. I think with the way that the music industry has kind of shrunk, those kind of placements in games are becoming like gold dust now. And if you're competing against a major record company who might be giving away 5 tracks for free and then charging them for 1 track, it's quite a difficult arena to be in. However, again, it's like, your track might just be perfect for a certain type of game. So there's no harm in kind of targeting a games company when you know that they've got a release coming up and they need a dozen tracks. Your track might just be the one that they love. However, having said that, it is an area that's really swamped. It's very, very difficult to get a placement in a game these days. And also, but the upside is, if you're in a game that's incredibly successful, you can really leverage that for your own releases, and it's great publicity. It's incredible, and so. But again, that's a separate thing to what Colin and I have been chatting mostly about, which is the custom composing for games.
I'll probably just add to that.
Two sides.
The thing that works best when it comes to getting your particular music into a game is to approach games companies directly. But not in the shotgun approach where you just send all your music to every video games company, because like I get pitched stuff a lot, and if I get something where it's just like, my music would be great for your game, well, I can tell within about a paragraph or two whether they know anything about my company, my game, my history, what I've done. So if I sniff a kind of generic email, it's like, I'm out. Whereas if I get an email from somebody who says, I've played your game, I noticed this, it's like, well, here's somebody who's clearly played it and knows what they're talking about. And I've got this track and I think it would work here for these reasons. It's like, well, okay, you've got my attention at that point. Let's, it might go somewhere from there. Now, I'm not saying that's a surefire way of achieving an in into the video games industry, because it is circumstantial. But you've got a much better chance of establishing a relationship at that point than if you just spam everybody. It's like CVs as well, right? If you say, I'm looking for a job, that's one conversation. I'm looking for a job with you to do this because I notice you have this problem with your product and I want to help you fix it. Right? Well, it comes across really different when you're on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, it's really that's the sync industry. It's like getting your music synced in a game is it's as random as as getting sync in music for films or TV. Really, you've got to build up a relationship. You've got to know the person you're speaking to. what projects they're working on, how they like to work. The worst thing for a music supervisor, whether they're working in a game or for a film, is to be bombarded. Here's my 30 best tracks. You just kind of like, there's so much music now. There's so many options that you have to take a much more targeted approach. I think.
You mentioned a couple of sort of events across Scotland. Can you just give us another couple of examples of maybe some opportunities in Scotland specifically that composers should be like researching and exploring, just like attending different events or conventions?
Yeah, there is one website that I would encourage composers to go to that has a lot of good information, because we haven't had a time to chat about the type of deals you can do, retaining your rights or buyouts and all that stuff. There's a website called audiogang.org. That's one word, audiogang.org. And it was set up by US composers quite a few years ago as a resource for guys, freelancers working in the games industry. There's a lot of technical information on there, but there's also a lot of good case studies about how you can structure a deal with a games company, for your music. With The Bard's Tale, I licensed all my music to the games company. I was in a position to do that, which meant that, I've now released 3 of the soundtracks on Spotify, and, it has a life of its own out with the game. So, yeah, audiogang.org is the website, I think. And apart from that, and that Scottish Games get-together thing, I wish Colin
I'm
was
actually just looking right now to see if I can find it, but I can't. What I'll do is I'll speak to him afterwards and ask if he can provide a link, and we'll share it. We'll get the organisers to share it with everybody who's followed.
He does a good newsletter as well, which is kind of like every 2 weeks, about mostly focused on game awards or game conferences and stuff like that. So it's definitely worth checking that out. I always sort of tune into that to see what's going on, really. And again, the thing is, Kaylee, that the Scottish games industry is a big, friendly place, right? Everyone has worked together to kind of build it into what it is. So I've found everyone that I've ever dealt with being incredibly welcoming and accommodating, and we'll all help each other out. So it's not a scary, daunting place to try and introduce yourself and to get a foothold in the industry. If you've got something to offer, there's always people in this industry that are there to listen, really. You just need to approach them right. It's like anything.
They're really optimistic words, I think, for every artist listening right now, because as you said, it does seem to be a lot of big artists and major players who get the syncs. So I just, reaching out and contacting them as an independent artist and trying to build that relationship is your first step, and we're all in the same sort of boat and position here. So yeah, just as much research as you can do on a company before you approach them, definitely.
Yeah, another thing to think about is, think about changing the terms under which you define your band, right? If you've got a band, you maybe got a drummer, guitarist, bass player, whatever. Contact somebody in the games industry and ask if they want to be the interactive designer for the band. That just handles the online components and creates interactive wrappers around songs. That's one area I've been meaning to explore for ages and just never quite got around to it. Is we talk about music for games. I think there's a whole new kind of industry that's waiting to happen, which is games for music. Like, one of the best things about a game is that repetitive nature of it. Play it round and round and round. If it's like a small arcade game, you could build a game around a piece of music. So if you've got a great piece of music, take it to a game designer and see if they want to build an experience around that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, Colin. Just leads me on to my last question then, is just what do you see for the future of gaming and music? Maybe start with you, Ged.
Well, I mean, right at this moment, as I said, I'm fortunate enough to have a sort of separate career as a games composer. Otherwise, you know, it would have been a real challenge, I think. You know, like to kind of, you know, we tour 6 months of the year. We're kind of, this year was our 40th anniversary, Simple Minds 40th anniversary, and so when those shows, you know, for most bands now, they make their money on shows. So it was definitely you know, fortuitous for me to switch to the other side of my career. So that's all I would say is that no matter what aspect of music you're in, you have to really stay open-minded. I was open-minded 25 years ago when I got involved in games, and I thought, I don't know where this is going to lead, but hey, this looks pretty interesting. You never know where you're going to kind of, your music is going to end up. And I think if you stay open-minded about it, you know, even what we're talking about, if you get a placement in a game, then, you know, your whole kind of release schedule should be benefiting from the release of that game. And, you know, you can be putting out stuff around that and using gaming channels to be able to bring people to your music. So I think you know, not everyone's cut out to be a games composer because, you know, you have to adapt to what you're doing. However, all games need music. All games, if you've got crap music in a game now, it is like so noticeable, right? Because it's become so sophisticated in terms of what it does to the gamer when he's playing the game. And so I do think stay open-minded about everything, you know, and keep creating. And if games are your thing, then you know, the door's open.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. That was a great chat and great insight for composers. Thank you so much. We've got our last session coming up. It will be our keynote speech. That will be our last session for today. If everyone wants to go take a wee break before that. But yeah, a huge thank you for everyone who's tuned in. And we're going to move on to Amo Talwar from Punch Records. He's going to be leading the keynote with Tam Coyle from Scottish Music Industry Association. And they're going to do a chat on progress and profit through diversity. That will be back here in about 10-15 minutes. So go and have a wee break. I hope you guys are all enjoying Resonate Online, and I will see you guys shortly. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks a lot. See you, Keely. Bye.